The story begins in the heart of imperial China, where the rule of emperors stretched over centuries and dynasties rose and fell like the tides of the Yellow River. It was a civilization of brilliance, of poetry, invention, and philosophy, but also of cruelty, where law and power were enforced with punishments so disturbing that they continue to haunt the imagination. Justice in ancient China was not only about correction, it was about fear. To disobey the emperor was not merely a crime, it was a challenge to the very order of heaven itself, and the punishments devised for such defiance were as creative as they were terrifying. One of the most infamous of these was the 5 punishments, a system used for centuries that evolved from corporal pain to mutilation. In early dynasties, offenders might be tattooed with ink that branded their faces forever, marking them as criminals in the eyes of society. Others lost their noses, their feet, or even their reproductive organs, forced to live lives of shame and humiliation. For those condemned to castration, it was not only the destruction of body but also of family legacy, a punishment that erased both dignity and the possibility of descendants. These mutilations were meant to be permanent scars, a lifetime of suffering long after the moment of pain. But the cruelty did not end there. Under the Han Dynasty, a punishment known as scorching, or disgrace penalties, spread terror across the land. Criminals were paraded through the streets in chains, their bodies beaten, their heads shaved, their crimes written on placards hung around their necks. The punishment was not death but the destruction of honor, and in a culture where reputation meant everything, it was a sentence worse than execution. Families of the condemned bore the shame as well, for in ancient China guilt was often collective, spreading from father to son, mother to daughter, so that one mistake could ruin generations. Perhaps the most haunting, however, was a punishment known as lingqi, the death by 1,000 cuts. Though its name alone carries dread, the reality was far darker. Victims were bound and slowly carved by executioners, each cut designed to prolong life while stripping flesh piece by piece. The agony lasted hours, sometimes days, until the condemned finally succumbed to shock or blood loss. It was not simply an execution, it was a performance, staged before officials and citizens to remind them of the emperor's absolute power. Every slice was a lesson carved into flesh, a warning that betrayal or treason would not only kill you but erase your humanity, reducing you to fragments of meat. In the quiet streets of ancient cities, whispers of these punishments spread like fire. To see a man without his nose, to watch a eunuch serving the court, to hear the cries of a prisoner carved alive, these sights and sounds were reminders that the law was not mercy but terror. Ancient China was a civilization that created wonders, but within its shadows, it also created nightmares, punishments that turned human life into a theater of suffering. And as we step deeper into its history, the horrors only grow darker. As dynasties tightened their grip on power, punishments in ancient China became not only instruments of pain but tools of spectacle, carefully designed to terrify the masses into obedience. Among these was the dreaded, boiling punishment. Those condemned were lowered alive into great cauldrons of oil or water, their screams echoing as flesh blistered and peeled. Sometimes executioners staged this in public squares, the bubbling liquid releasing steam thick with the scent of burning flesh. To the crowd, it was both horror and lesson, a reminder that betrayal of the emperor meant being cooked alive, your death as slow as it was gruesome. Equally horrifying was the punishment known as crushing. Victims were forced beneath heavy wooden beams or stones that slowly broke their bones under unbearable weight. In some cases, their chests were compressed until their breath stopped, death coming only after prolonged agony. This cruelty was not simply to kill, but to destroy dignity, to turn the human body into a spectacle of collapse, crushed before the watchful eyes of soldiers and citizens alike. Another terrifying method was the use of slicing the waist. In this punishment, criminals accused of grave crimes like treason were tied to a post, and their bodies were cut in half across the waist with a swift strike. The victim often remained conscious for a few agonizing moments, his upper body gasping in horror as life drained away. Executions like these were designed not just for justice but for fear, ensuring the memory of such death spread far beyond the city walls. The punishments often targeted not only individuals but entire families. In what was known as nine kinship execution, if a man was accused of betraying the throne, his guilt extended to his parents, siblings, children, and even distant relatives. Whole bloodlines were wiped out in a single decree, homes reduced to ashes, names erased from records. In these moments, the emperor's will became divine judgment, showing that no one, no matter how distant, was safe from the stain of disloyalty. Fear did not stop at the condemned, it seeped into generations. Even seemingly milder punishments carried a cruelty of their own. Public beatings with bamboo rods or whips were commonplace, but the lashes were so severe that backs split open and bones cracked beneath the skin. Prisoners often died days later from infection or internal bleeding. Others were left crippled, hobbling through the rest of their lives as walking reminders of imperial authority. For the rulers of China, it was not enough to kill, punishment had to transform the body into a message, visible proof of what awaited anyone who dared to defy order. In these rituals of pain, law and terror became one. The people of ancient China lived not only under the shadow of the Great Wall or the splendor of the Forbidden City but also under the constant knowledge that justice was sharp, merciless, and absolute. Each punishment, whether it was boiling in oil, being torn in half, or seeing one's family destroyed, was part of a system that turned fear into loyalty. Yet the most infamous punishment of all, the one that still haunts memory, remained the dreaded death by 1,000 cuts, a torment that lingered in whispers and nightmares alike, awaiting its victims in the deepest corners of imperial justice. The punishments of ancient China were not only about the body, they were about the mind. They left behind scars that stretched across families, communities, and generations. Death was not always the worst outcome, sometimes, survival itself was a curse. Eunuchs, men castrated as part of their sentence, lived in constant humiliation, stripped of both masculinity and lineage, their names mocked even as they served in the emperor's court. Branded criminals walked the streets with ink carved into their flesh, forever marked as outcasts. In a society that valued honor above all, such punishments destroyed more than life, they destroyed identity. The psychological terror extended beyond the condemned. To witness a man boiled alive, to see a body cut in half, or to walk past the disfigured remains of a flogged prisoner was to live with constant fear. The empire ensured that everyone knew obedience was survival, and rebellion was ruin. Justice was never about fairness, it was about power, control, and the emperor's unchallenged authority. In many ways, the punishments became performance, a grim theater staged to remind people that the throne was sacred, and disobedience would be paid for in flesh. Ling Qi, the infamous death by 1,000 cuts, became the symbol of this cruelty. It was not just execution, it was annihilation. Victims were bound, their flesh carved slowly with precision, each slice designed to prolong agony, to force them to die not once, but 1,000 times. Sometimes opium was given to keep them conscious longer, forcing them to endure while crowds and officials looked on. By the end, there was nothing left but a ruined form, a body stripped of its humanity. Ling Qi was meant to erase not only life but also memory, ensuring the condemned would be remembered only as broken and disgraced. Yet these punishments, as horrifying as they were, also reveal the fragile balance of power in ancient China. A dynasty's strength did not rest only on armies or walls but on fear, fear woven into daily life, fear etched into skin, fear that lived in silence. The punishments kept order, but they also sowed resentment, planting seeds of rebellion that would, in time, topple dynasties. For when cruelty becomes law, the people may obey, but they do not forget. Today, these punishments live on in legend and history books, reminders of a time when the state wielded pain as its greatest weapon. They shock us not only because of their brutality but because they reveal the extremes to which human beings will go when power becomes unchecked. The Great Wall, the Forbidden City, the poetry of Confucius, all stand as testaments to China's greatness. But alongside them, in the shadows, stand the memories of boiling cauldrons, mutilated bodies, and blood-soaked executions. The most disturbing punishments of ancient China were more than cruelty, they were warnings carved into history. They show us that while empires may rise in glory, they often rule in terror, and the echoes of that terror can last far longer than the stones of palaces or the ink of scrolls. In the silence of forgotten prisons, and in the whispers of stories passed down through centuries, the screams of the condemned still linger, haunting reminders that power, when unchecked, turns justice into horror.